Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking around to the last session of the day. I'm Emily Parker, Executive Director of Global Content at Coindesk, joined by this excellent panel. We have Howard Fisher, Nizam Ismail, and also Kablae Kim. So let's just get right to it. Okay. We have, okay, perfect. Wait, this is not the first slide. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give a very quick presentation, just sort of going all over the world, and then opening it up to this expert panel. So just touching upon what I see as some of the most interesting trends in global regulation and policy worldwide. We're going to really jump around the world here. Okay, so I chose just a few jurisdictions that I think are particularly interesting. We have Korea and Singapore, in no particular order. Korea, Singapore, Dubai, Europe, Japan, and Hong Kong. And I'm going to touch upon why I think these are particularly interesting. Okay, let's start with Korea for obvious reasons, because we are in Korea. I'm not going to talk too much about Korea because we have an expert here who can speak about Korea. But I just want to talk a little bit about what catches the attention of the outside world when we think about the Korean crypto market. So there's a few things. One, Korea is a powerful retail market, one of the most powerful in the world. I personally think that it does not get as much attention as it should. There's very powerful centralized exchanges in Korea. This conference is being hosted by the largest one, Upbit. Other thing that's very important about Korea is its interest in altcoins and its ability to drive up the price of altcoins. So basically this slide are two things that I find particularly interesting. One is just the sheer size of the Korean market. Approximately 6 million Korean investors in the first half of 2023. That's more than 10% of the entire population. That's a really big number, especially considering that it's only retail. And then the second, this is just a note about Ripple. So I can tell you sometimes my colleagues and I will be sitting in New York and we'll suddenly see the price of a coin, maybe it's XRP, just surge. And nobody knows why. And then we look at Korean exchange data and we're like, oh, that's why. It's because of the Korean market. So this is a market that's clearly very important to pay attention to. Okay, now we're just going to go to Europe, which is a totally different area. Europe, this is another place that's worth watching. Why? Because at the end of next year, Europe will be introducing MiCA, which is comprehensive regulation for the 27 member states of the European Union. Now, this is impressive and very ambitious because we're from the United States. We only have one country that does not have comprehensive regulation. This is 27 countries that has comprehensive regulation. So this is a very, very ambitious project. Now, there's a lot of criticisms of MiCA still because it's, hasn't even started yet. This is a chart from an article in Coindesk by my colleague, just looking at some of the advantages and the disadvantages. The advantages are obvious, legal certainty, regulatory clarity, it's clear. The disadvantages are the rules are really tough. You can pay really heavy fines if you get it wrong. MiCA's approach to stablecoins in particular is a little bit controversial because, for example, there's a cap on transactions per day for US dollar stablecoins. And I think there's been some complaints within the community that it will be difficult to issue stablecoins in Europe. But anyway, it's all part of a process. And I think this illustrates the difficulty in establishing clear rules without making them overly restrictive. Okay, so going to another country here, Japan. Now Japan, I'm focusing on Japan for a minute, in part because it's one of the countries that I know best. I've spent a lot of time in Japan, but also because I think it's a very, very important example. So Japan was one of the first movers in crypto, and a lot of bad things happened in Japan. For example, as many of you know, one of the first crypto exchanges was Mt. Gox in Japan, which was hacked. And then in 2018, another major Japanese exchange was hacked, CoinCheck. And Japanese regulators reacted to these hacks by putting in place very stern regulations. And there's a few key ones. For example, segregation of assets. This is for exchanges. It just basically means that you have to separate customer assets from the exchange's own assets. This proved to be critically important with FTX. FTX did not do that, and that's one of the reasons why customers lost so much money. Japanese exchanges must entrust money to third-party institutions. Another important thing, stablecoins. I feel like very few people know that Japan is one of the first countries in the world to have stablecoin regulations actually go into effect. Almost nobody else has done this. Europe hasn't done it, America hasn't done it. There are actually stablecoin regulations in Japan that were passed into law. This is a very big deal. There still are no stablecoins in Japan because they're creating them now, but yes, this is very important. And then also a cold wallet requirement for exchanges, another way to protect customer funds. So quickly, here's the important point here. Over the past few years, I spent a lot of time in Japan. Many people criticized Japan and said Japanese regulation was too strict, right? That started to change last year when FTX collapsed because, as you can see on the right, an article from Coindesk, Japan was the safest place to be an FTX customer. That meant that FTX Japan users were one of the few places that could get their money back because of the regulation that I just said, segregation of assets. It just meant that FTX Japan could not reach into customer assets and just do whatever they wanted. So Japanese regulation had a huge victory, and we started to see people have a different opinion about it. Okay, we're just really covering every country here, but Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. Again, we have someone from Singapore on the panel. I'm not going to spend too long on it, but I want to highlight these three places because they have something very, very important in common. One, you will commonly hear these three places referred to as crypto-friendly. Singapore, crypto-friendly, Dubai, crypto-friendly, Hong Kong recently, because the Hong Kong government has been making a big push on crypto, you hear them saying these are three crypto-friendly places. The other thing they have in common is that it is not easy to do crypto business in any of these places, like not at all. And I think that's a really important thing to make clear. Crypto-friendly does not mean easy at all. Crypto-friendly, what it means is that there are clear regulations in these three places. But Singapore, and again, we can talk about this more, Singapore, it's arguable if it's friendly, right? Singapore is very, very strict, very, very strict. For example, on crypto marketing, ATMs, we'll get into that more. Hong Kong, incredibly strict. Hong Kong is getting a lot of attention because it unveiled a licensing regime for crypto exchanges. As of now, there are only 2 licensed crypto exchanges in Hong Kong, and they are very restricted in what they can do. Dubai also has a comprehensive licensing regime for exchanges, but not easy, and the fees are high. So now we're getting to our homeland, the United States. This is an example of a country that is neither friendly or easy or clear. So this is an important thing you hear a lot about in the US. It's called regulation by enforcement. This is a very common criticism of US regulation that you'll hear from the crypto community. What does it mean? Again, Howard can talk about this in more detail, but basically what the criticism is that because the United States does not have a comprehensive, clear crypto framework, often we find out what the regulation is when the SEC decides to punish somebody. And these are some examples on the screen of some cases by the SEC. By the way, this is only a small selection. There are many, many, many more. I just chose some of the more famous ones. So what is the problem with this approach? There are many problems. First of all, in some cases, you can have a company like Ripple, for example, spending years and millions of dollars fighting the SEC. That's not very efficient, right? And imagine if you're a small startup, who wants to do that? It would be much better if you knew what you could do in the beginning. The second reason is that for startups that are trying to decide, okay, where should I go? Should I go to Singapore? Should I go to Dubai? Should I go to the United States? They don't want to deal with this, right? They don't want to go to a place where they don't know what's a security and what's not a security, and they're only going to find out when they appear on a slide like this, right? So it's really having a cost, I think, to US innovation. Okay, so finally, I just want to end this on a slightly brighter note, because that was, it's not all good news, but there are some things that I think are positive to look out for in the coming months. So one is, I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a lot of excitement about tokenization, real-world asset tokenization, RWA. We're hearing about that in Asia and the United States. That can be anything from, art to tokenized treasuries, but this is clearly a big trend, and some people see it as a gateway to traditional finance. The second, very close to my heart, Asia. people are finally understanding how important Asia is in crypto. I mean, for people who pay attention, this was always very obvious, but I think now, with the mood in the United States, I think people really understand that if you want to be a player in crypto, you have to deal with the Asia market. So I think this is a good thing. I think people are starting to understand this. Third is stablecoin regulation. I just mentioned Japan is one of the leaders in the space, but we're going to start seeing more stablecoin regulations from around the world. And I think this is going to be really interesting as people struggle to kind of create stablecoin regulation that balances, security and profitability. Fourth, I didn't really get a chance to get into this, but it's still important, central bank digital currencies. We heard a lot about them for a while, especially China. You don't hear about them that much, but there's still over 100 countries exploring them, and it's still something to pay attention to. Again, some people do not like them at all, so it's arguable if this is a good or a bad trend, but it's still a trend. And finally, this I think would be seen as bullish, is high hopes for the first Bitcoin spot ETF in the United States. The crypto community has been waiting for this for years. In recent months, simple rumors about this appear to push up Bitcoin's price. And now, I don't know, there seems to be relative optimism. I'll see what Howard thinks. But anyway, so those are some of the things to look out for. And anyway, we will get into all these in much more detail. So thank you. Okay.
So let me start. Is this on?
I don't know. Go for it. Jump right in.
All right, let me just start out by saying, first of all, I'm really thrilled to be here in South Korea. This is my first trip to South Korea. And I do a lot of speaking at public events and at conferences. And in the US, as a former prosecutor, I find that in a lot of conferences, there's usually one or two, sometimes more people in an audience who I've prosecuted, whose companies I've prosecuted, or whose friends and family I've prosecuted. So I'm pretty sure there's no one here that I've charged. If I've ever charged anyone here, just raise your hand. Okay, good. The first thing I want to comment on, and that was a great summary, so thank you for that, is that it's been a really inspiring conference. I've heard a lot of people speak about opportunities, about market trends, about enthusiasm amongst consumers and investors. And maybe it's because I flew here last night and I have absolutely no idea what time it is or what day it is, that I might be a little less diplomatic than I normally am not. And I want to throw a little bit of cold water on that enthusiasm. And that cold water is basically US regulatory intervention, interference, or over-aggressiveness in the crypto and digital asset market. Right now, US regulators are on the warpath against digital assets. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that there is a perception, especially given the events of the last year, that there's a lot of fraud, insecurity, and instability in the digital asset market. The other is based on the fact that in the US, what you call something matters. So in 1933, the US creates the SEC, creates the Securities and Exchange Act and the Securities Act, and the definitions from these 1933 and 1934 acts are what determines how crypto assets are treated in the US. And I don't want to get into a complicated question about what makes something a security, what doesn't make it a security, but the fact is that there are certain things about digital assets that put it within the SEC's ambit. And that means that anything that has a US connection is at risk. Now, you may think, okay, there's a problem in the US. What does that matter? The US is not the center of the world, although we think we are. And the fact is, New York is the center of the world, not the rest of the US, but we'll leave that to the side. It matters because not only does the US have a very expansive view of what constitutes a security and what should be regulated as such, it also has a very expansive view of its jurisdiction. Anything that touches the US is a matter for US enforcement agencies. Does the money go through a bank account in the US? Regulators have jurisdiction. Are there customers in the US? US regulators and criminal authorities have jurisdiction. Did anything happen in the US that was part of something that happens somewhere else in the world, US regulators consider that they have jurisdiction. And as Emily said, when she went down that list of like 10 cases, there are 50 cases.
Yeah, there's
And every day, like right before we went on, I checked the SEC website to make sure that there was nothing filed that would change everything I was going to say, because pretty much every single week, there is a significant SEC enforcement case or settlement that was filed. And that encompasses not just digital assets, it's been extended to enforcement cases involving NFTs, involving staking, involving every aspect of the digital ecosystem. And so I think that while there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of talk and a lot of activity in Asia and in Europe, the fact that the US does not have a regulatory system other than regulation by enforcement, is it going to operate necessarily as a significant drag on this industry? And I hate to be the voice of pessimism at what has been a very optimistic conference, but as my wife says, that's who I am.
Those are all great points. I want to get to you guys too. I mean, just to like respond quickly to those certain things. I mean, the fact that the U.S. has jurisdiction, and sometimes that can be a good thing. I mean, I think that was kind of a good thing with FTX, right? In the sense that like they were able to find very creative ways to go after FTX, which was not a U.S. exchange, and basically nail him on 7 charges. But you know, anyway, let's turn to Korea for a moment. I mean, just here's the thing about Howard, just to point the other side, like what the SEC says is like, well, you know, we have rules for securities and the crypto companies just don't want to play by the rules. Like that's, you know, and yeah, it's a controversial opinion, but that's their view. So just turning to CAB for a second, I mean, do you feel that like Korea has a better or a clearer outlook towards at least regulation? I mean, you know, I hear different things about Korea. Like on the one hand, some people say Korea has a clearer view on securities, for example. But then sometimes when I'm in Korea, I hear about things called like, you know, shadow regulation or, you know, so I'd like to hear, where does Korea stand in terms of regulatory clarity?
Yeah, a good question. But it's very hard to say in a word because in various perspectives, the government has, you know, I think that different, you know, position. In some area, governments are very, very, you know, market friendly. But in other area, like the ban on the initial, you know, crypto offering or something, you know, that's very hostile to the crypto market. But I think that currently there's a new trend. You, Emily, you pointed out the trend like, you know, tokenization of RWA or tokenization of payment itself, stablecoins or CBDC. I think that currently the paradigm is not the matter of, you know, more or less regulation. I think that the more important thing is the clarity itself. So, for example, in Korea, the current government's national task is one of the most important tasks of the government is the establishing infrastructure and regulatory framework for digital asset. So some people from the, you know, crypto industry criticize that they are regulating, but the thing is, we should focus on the infrastructure, new infrastructure based on new regulation. I think that one of the example is that, you know, you told us that, you know, in Korea there are so many, you know, XRP, you know, investors. We call them XRP armies. And in Korea, there's very famous proverb, you know, 리또소 is in Korean, 리플에 또 속았다. That means that, you know, again we get cheated by the price. But currently, I think that most of the legal risk about the Ripple XRP, about securities are lifted because the summary judgment said that XRP itself is not security, and the SEC admit that during appealing intermediary appeal. But the thing is, if you see the summary judgment, the Ripple cannot do their main business named, you know, ODL, on-demand liquidity program, because for that, they need a sale to the institutional investors with sales contract or something. So, my point is that, to your question, I think that currently it's not a matter of crypto friendly or not. I think that if the government give you some opportunity for new infrastructure, you should try to understand the new regulation or new trend for the, I think that legislation, then you will have a change. For example, ETF. If the United States allow the Bitcoin spot ETF, the Korean government will consider the introduction of Bitcoin spot ETF. But the thing is, currently, there's no rules and regulation about the custodian of the Bitcoin for the ETF. So there would be a competition among traditional trust company and big tech like Kakao, or crypto service provider like Dunamu. So if you understand very well about the regulation and you can meet the requirements for their fiduciary duty or something, you can be the custodian for the ETF, and then that means that you can be, be very big company for the custodian business in Korea. So, yeah. But anyway, we should focus on the new infrastructure based on new regulation. So I think that more or less regulation is not a matter, but we need more clarity.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to turn to, thank you for that. I just want to turn to Nizam for a second because I feel like you can weigh in on a lot of these points, but the tokenization and the digital assets thing is really interesting because my impression from Singapore is that Singapore is really into tokenization. They like tokenization and they like digital assets. They're a little more hesitant about crypto, especially retail. And I just give us like the landscape, what's going on in Singapore, and also can you really separate those things? Like, can you embrace tokenization and digital assets, but not like crypto? Because I feel like there's a bunch of countries that are sort of trying to do that, and I'm just curious what your take is.
Sure. I think you're right on point, Emily. There seems to be some bifurcation that tokenization of real assets, whether it is securities, real estate, that's all welcome and in fact catalyzed by the regulators. So if you look at the agenda for the Singapore FinTech Festival that's coming up in a couple of days' time, there's a lot of emphasis on tokenization. There have been projects that have been sponsored by the MES to try and catalyze, to try and get involved. The various, ironically, the TradFi players, including the banks, to be involved in real-world tokenization. But I think when you do that, but at the same time, on the other hand, what has happened is that, yes, I think Singapore was initially applauded for having very clear regulations. We had the Payment Services Act, which was implemented in 2020, and that gave a regulatory framework that clearly regulates crypto intermediaries like exchanges and broker-dealers. And even in 2017, there were a set of guidelines that facilitated initial coin offerings or ICOs because there's clarity issued by the MES. But along the way, and I think crypto is a victim of its own success, with the increasing uptake and success of cryptocurrencies globally, and I think Singapore was one crypto player, there suddenly became a greater sensitivity on the part of the regulators on consumer protection. And then they started talking the language that, we don't encourage retail participation in cryptocurrencies because of the volatility. People might not understand what they purchase. And I think that's maybe understandable, but I think in 2022, what the MES did was, I think, an aberration in their progressive stance towards crypto so far. They actually imposed a ban on marketing or advertising that encourages retail participation in cryptocurrencies. So if you're a crypto exchange licensed in Singapore, you can't advertise anywhere else except for your own official website. And I think a lot of players felt that was regression because those rules are suddenly, overcompensative. They are even more strict compared to even securities offerings, because there are no restrictions against advertising for securities players, even if you offer very complex securities like contract for differences or derivatives. But unfortunately, that was rolled out overnight, and it wasn't great also because of the manner in which it was done. It was rolled out in the absence of any consultation with the industry. So that was, to me, a very, I won't use the word dark period, it's probably overstating it, but there was something negative on the part of the MES.
It's interesting because Singapore is really famous for being consultative with the industry, right? It's always, people always talk about that, so that's an interesting, yeah.
Yes, and also in the same stroke of regulatory change, there was a ban on retail ATMs in Singapore. So the retail ATMs had to close shop almost overnight. So that wasn't great. And so, we've had lots of engagement with the MES since then. And one of the things that, back to your point, that we took issue with is this artificial, distinction between tokenization and cryptocurrencies. Because to me, they're all part of the same ecosystem. They're different sides of the same coin. You can't promote digital assets on the one hand without, at the same time, acknowledging the value that cryptocurrencies play in lubricating the whole digital assets ecosystem. So that would be my view on it.
Yeah, just one quick follow-up though. What do you think, because you're basically, I think what you said is really interesting. Early on, Singapore was really celebrated as this leader, and you're saying that it kind of changed over the past few years. What do you think made them change? Because in a lot of times what I've observed is that sometimes it's like an incident, right? But you're talking about like pre-FTX, this change happened. So what made them less open to crypto?
I think part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, crypto being a victim of its own success. There's more and more retail participation. I don't think we actually reached a stage where people were protesting on the streets, because that's illegal in Singapore anyway. But there was, to me, an overcompensation in terms of investor protection. People, I think, the regulators became unduly worried about investors losing their monies. But to me, that's antithetical to the whole concept of a disclosure-based regime, which Singapore says it embraces. I think the US has a similar system, where the role of the regulator is not to ensure that only quality investments go out to the market, but you ensure good, timely, full disclosure of material information. But ultimately, investors will have to make their own decisions, their own informed decisions. And I think the better approach would have been to empower the investors through consumer education so that they understand the risks that they are entering into, and they are accepting and embracing those risks by entering into a Bitcoin purchase, whatever it is.
I want to return to something that Howard said, because Howard actually made a really provocative point. I want to kind of go back to, first of all, that we shouldn't be excited or optimistic. I mean, I'm going to summarize your point. And second of all, that also kind of like the U.S., you're just sort of saying that the U.S. is very powerful in this industry, and I think there are two ways to look at that. Everything you said is absolutely true, and it was amazing. I mean, if you look at the FTX complaint, I mean, the U.S. can basically say like, you sent an email while that went through the U.S. and thus it's our jurisdiction. You're absolutely right about that. But like, I guess I'm just curious for all of you. I mean, is the U.S. really that important anymore, right? I mean, because, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer. I mean, on the one hand, what you're saying is true. The U.S. clearly is important. But on the other hand, what if you just go and you set up in Singapore or Hong Kong or Tokyo or Korea or whatever? Like, is the U.S. still really such a critical player in this industry that even if they have an unfriendly regulatory environment, it's really going to like stop progress?
I mean, I think there are three reasons why the U.S. is important, and maybe it's four. And the fourth is I'm from the U.S., so it would hurt my feelings if we weren't that important. But I think it is important for three reasons. The first is that the U.S. is an important source of capital for investment, and if crypto is a forbidden category for U.S. investors, that's cutting off a large source of capital. Less important now than it would have been a few years ago. The second is that there are a lot of consumers of digital asset products that are residing in the US. And so cutting off that base is also important. I don't think those are as key though, because look, there are millions of people outside, many more people outside the US than inside the US, and those are large enough markets and large enough capital pools that they could make up for the loss of the US. I think what makes the US still critically important is its enforcement power. And it's not just that, as you pointed out, the US could basically exercise jurisdiction over anything that has a remote connection to the US. The other thing is that the US has an enforcement culture that I think is unique in the developed world. In almost every part of the world, especially in Asia and now in Europe, regulators will try to work with members of the industry, whatever that industry is, and the enforcement agencies tend to be underfunded and not to have a tradition of active enforcement. That is not the case in the US. Just looking at that chart, which is only like 10%, there is a culture of law enforcement in the US where if you, and I'll tell you, look, I used to be part of that. I was a prosecutor for 10 years at the SEC, and sometimes when we'd be talking to regulators in other jurisdictions, they would be shocked at how aggressive we were, and just astonished that we would consider just bringing charges as the first reaction to something, as opposed to saying, well, this is a problem, how could we work it out? The US reaction is, this is a problem, who can we sue and who can we arrest? And even if the rest of the non-US world develops in terms of the size of its capital and in terms of the size of its user base, there's still that threat of a US enforcement action that I think will always have to be reckoned with.
But what's interesting, the contradiction here, and I understand everything you're saying, that the interesting contradiction is that even amidst all these enforcement actions, we seem to be on the cusp of the first ever spot Bitcoin ETF, which is, it doesn't really make sense, right?
Well, but I'll point out that the SEC had to be sued and had to lose a court case in order for it to be forced to consider a spot Bitcoin ETF. And meanwhile, even though the SEC lost that case and was ordered to undergo a rulemaking procedure, it still hasn't done it.
Interesting. So let's turn back to Cap again for a second, because we talked about this a little bit at dinner. Let's hear your perspective. I mean, how much does the U.S. matter in Korea, right? I mean, is Korea paying attention to the U.S.? You mentioned that, Korean regulators were really paying a lot of attention to Europe and MiCA. Do they care what's going on in the U.S.? Do you think, like, for example, Korea would see something happening in the U.S. and think like, okay, we would follow that? Because I mean, that's an interesting data point, right, about how U.S. regulation affects other countries.
Yeah, very good question. I think that, as you know, last July, we passed, Virtual Asset User Protection Act. It consists of, anti-fraud and segregation of customers' assets from the providers. So it's just a first stage act, and we have second stage act under the table now. So mostly we benchmark the MiCA of EU. The interesting thing is, the devils are in details, right? So when it comes to the, execution of, for example, market manipulation or insider trading, in Korea, I think that we benchmarked Japanese Act and US Act. As you know, Japanese Act was very, influenced by the United States. So our practice or our supervisory, practice is all more like the United States. So US, as you said, the US has a big market with, better investor base. So the market is big and the system is similar. So that's very, influential on the Korean market. But the thing is, when it comes to the Howey test, we benchmarked Howey test also. But but as you know, our system is like more civil coded system, right? So there's 4 elements of Howey: investment of money in common enterprise, and the profits are from the efforts of others. And the investor should have the expectation of profit. But in the expectation of profit, in Korea, expectation right is very blurring or something, so our legislator changed it to the right for the profit. So in that sense, we have more clarity in how it tests or something. So my point is that so in Korea, we have some mixture when it comes to the crypto legislation. There's a MiCA framework and US practice. So we should make the best of both systems, not to make the worst of both systems. So that's the point, I think. Yeah, still, detail, the devils are in details in Korea.
So I kind of feel like you're the most optimistic person on this panel.
Yes.
Yeah, which is interesting because that's interesting. The voice from Korea, but you two are a little less so. I think it's fair to say, or maybe not optimistic, but critical. I guess the question is like you're talking about the U.S. Enforcement action. You're saying Singapore has sort of taken a turn in a not great direction. So the question is like, what do you do about that? Like, what do you do? Like, how do you? I mean, because I think that's what the crypto community is asking. It's like, yeah, how do you kind of change those views?
Well, look, what's happening now in the US is literally what's happening now. But several things could happen. Congress could get its act together and craft a legislative framework for the regulation of digital assets and the regulation of digital enterprises like exchanges or broker-dealers.
Okay, but like what? Okay.
Okay, but right.
I'm just gonna go.
Right. Congress. Let's be serious. Congress is never going to get
Let's
its act
put
together.
the fan fiction away. Yeah. No, I mean, okay,
But the SEC could lose some of these cases, and what's important to note is that not a single SEC victory has gotten to the appeal stage as of yet. So not a single appeals court has ruled on any of these, and most of these cases were settlements. So it is possible that even if Congress doesn't get its act together, which will never happen, the SEC could lose, or they could win on an appellate level and ultimately get some kind of judicial finality as to what rules apply. The problem is that we're not going to get an appellate decision for at least a year or so. So it is very difficult to know how an enterprise should react to the current digital framework. And the problem is also not just that there's this aggressive mentality by the federal government, but that we have 50 states, and each state has a different regulatory scheme.
That's a really important point.
So you have companies like Coinbase, which was regulated and perfectly registered with the New York state authorities, but still got sued by the federal authorities.
Yeah, that's a great point.
If I can, maybe give a bit more nuance to my earlier comments, I think I agree with you that clear regulations is important. And to get to that state of clarity, what is important is having a very open, even if it's a robust dialogue between the industry and the regulators. So after that unfortunate rule change last year on retail marketing restrictions, I think to give credit to the regulators in Singapore, they had a couple more consultations, and these were quite major changes, including asset protection on consumers, including market abuse in the crypto sphere, including stablecoins regulations, where there was a lot more engagement. So even before the MAS released a formal consultation paper, there would be very intense, robust engagements within the industry groups, private consultations, just to minimize the risk of bad regulations happening. So that has happened. If you ask me whether there is still a love story, I think there probably is still a love story, but it's probably a little bit more conditional than what it was, which is probably true of most marriages. But I think going forward, the positive thing is that there is an acknowledgement of the value of digitization or tokenization of assets. And I think that is a good thing for the industry, because that allows you to make the argument that, hey, there is real value, real broader value that cryptocurrencies can bring to the broader economy.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And also, I mean, my personal opinion, so just to clarify, kind of, I was laughing about Congress, but here's the issue with Congress in the US, right? First of all, I think there's a general consensus that nothing is going to happen before the presidential election. And part of the reason has nothing to do with crypto. Part of the reason has to do with America has just so much going on, and it's just crypto is not going to take a priority. That seems to be a general. But I think there's another problem, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this, just in your own countries. Like, I think another problem, from my opinion, if you look at Congress, right? Congress, they are elected representatives, and they are serving. They need to be elected, and I don't think that there's a powerful enough reason for them to fight for crypto in the US, in the sense that I don't think a lot of Americans still see the reason or the use case for crypto. I don't think the politicians see it, and I don't think the voters see it. They see it still as like investment, speculation, but they're like, what do you use this for? I don't know anybody who pays with Bitcoin. Again, this isn't my personal view, but I do think this is still an obstacle, that like people are not seeing real use cases yet, and that makes it harder for politicians to fight for it. And the negative case becomes much more compelling because they see the FTXs and the scams. So anyway, I'm just wanted to throw that out there and see what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there is a significant base of support for digital asset in the digital asset industry in the US. There is a blockchain caucus in Congress. But for most of them, at least in their stated opinions, when they come out in support of blockchain or crypto, it's not because of the use case, it's for ideological reasons or because it'll create jobs. So we want to, compete with China, compete with Asia. That's like a big thing in the US right now. And so we therefore need to have much more of a lenient approach towards digital assets so we could be competitive and create jobs. But if you ask the same congressman, well, what exactly do you think people will then use these digital assets for? They'll say, well, we'll create jobs and compete with China. And I think you're exactly right that the use case has not been made on a political level yet in the US.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to the industries. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
In Singapore, I would very much doubt that any politician would, use crypto as part of its political platform to get votes. In truth, a lot of the regulation making is upon the initiative of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where I came from, although I left many, many years ago. And I think the MAS tends to benchmark itself against what other financial centers are doing to see what is the trend of regulations. And I think part of the problem in crypto regulations is the absence of, guidance internationally. Let's look at Southeast Asia for an example. Within Singapore, Bitcoin would be regulated as a payments token. In Malaysia, just across the causeway, Bitcoins would be regulated as securities, which is a bit unusual. Down in Indonesia, Bitcoins are regulated as commodities. So 3 countries, neighboring countries, 3 varying approaches towards regulation of cryptocurrencies. And I think the absence of an international standard setting body like IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commission, or the Basel Committee for Banks, or the IAIS for insurance, there isn't a international body for crypto that sets the standards in terms of how regulators should look at regulating cryptocurrencies. Having said that, IOSCO, I know, has formed a working group that looks at setting international benchmarks for crypto regulations. So I think maybe when that happens, there might be more clarity in terms of having the market's best practices for crypto regulations.
That's actually a perfect segue to kind of what I wanted to ask next, which is what are the prospects or what are the possibilities for kind of international cooperation in this area? Like, it's one thing to be like, oh, it'd be good to have this, but what is the likelihood that we would ever establish something like that when you really have so many different approaches around the world? What do you guys think?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, we're already seeing that happening. The Financial Action Task Force, which sets the international agenda for anti-money laundering, has already started a set of guidance on AML, CFT standards, anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism standards for virtual assets, they call it. There's some guidance on that already. And they've also introduced the travel rule, which essentially is an information sharing protocol between VASPs, between crypto intermediaries. The I think BIS has issued some guidance on stablecoins, which is being referred to a lot by regulators in terms of coming towards formulating their regulations. So that has happened. But I think more will happen going forward because it is, given the nature of cryptocurrencies, it is truly a global offering. So when FTX collapsed, actually a disproportionately high percentage of the users came from Singapore, even though we are a small country. But it is truly a borderless world.
I think I'm supposed to be the designated cynic or pessimist on this panel, but even so, I am actually optimistic about the long-range integration of global regulatory systems on this. But since I'm supposed to be the designated cynic and pessimist,
you can break the molds, yeah.
I think what's going to ultimately happen is that digital assets are going to be more and more well-established, more and more accepted, and more regulated like traditional financial assets, and crypto companies are going to be regulated like traditional financial institutions. Once that happens, and once the market activity becomes sufficiently large, the US is going to sign on.
Good point. And when it comes to EU and Korean Congress, I think that they are more active and aggressive in making regulatory framework as legislation, because I think that it's different from the United States. Your promotion of crypto industry is more market-based, but historically, EU and Korean governments are very active to make new industry as a kind of growth economic engine. So in that sense, our ultimate goal is to promote the market and the industry. I think the same for the EU. And so in that sense, I think that their regulation is in the long run to make the clear line for the playground. So I think that's a very positive approach, I think. And the funny thing is that it's about the taxation. In Korea, we made rules and regulations on the taxation on the capital gains from trading of cryptocurrencies, but it was the implementation was delayed twice. But next time, I don't know. But we should know that no taxation is not a blessing. If we make a taxation, that means that Bitcoin or Ethereum will be a kind of asset class. So in the long run, I think that like in the United States, you can deduct the loss from the Bitcoin with the loss from the stocks of Samsung Electronics. I think that in that sense, taxation itself can make the crypto market bigger and bigger. So like I told you, it's not a matter of more or less regulation or more or less taxation. I mean, the clarity is more important, I think.
So we're gonna have to turn to Q&A quickly, but in a second we have like a couple minutes. I don't know, Howard or some of you, if there's anything important you just want to say that you didn't get a chance to say? No?
I'm not completely pessimistic or cynical. I mean, naturally I am, that's my temperament, but I do think that as the digital asset world becomes more and more regulated, it's going to become more and more accepted, at least in the US. But I think some of the evangelical statements about crypto, that it is a way towards a decentralized, permissionless structure, free of governments, and it will promote freedom, I think that ethos is contradictory to the long-term survival of the ecosphere.
That's a great point. I totally know what you mean. I think that sometimes some of the crypto crowd in the US just doesn't really know how to communicate effectively. But I think the other side of it is that when do you, like, again, how do you get regulation while preserving some of the ideals of crypto, right? So it's you know, and some of the comments about, you know, tokenization and stuff, it gets a little far from what crypto was originally. So yeah, it's a really interesting and difficult balance. Quickly, we're about to turn to Q&A, but Cab, I promised you could make some comments in Korean.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
just quickly,
Only
like
for,
about
you know,
a minute.
you
So
know,
yeah.
for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
For the young generation from Korean crypto industry. 잠깐 좀 한국말로 좀 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 오늘 뭐
So I would just
재밌게
like to send out a
보시고
message
오셨죠?
in Korean for a moment. I hope you had a very enjoyable session. I also drew a lot of lessons from this panel as well. I just have one thing I want to say to the young investors in crypto. Emily just mentioned earlier, she touched on some global trends, real-world asset tokenization, and tokenization and payment, which is stable coins and CBDC, and Bitcoin spot ETFs. All of these, what do they imply? At the end of the day, it implies that with the fragmented security market and the traditional capital market and the crypto market, which is constantly growing, all of these markets are converging. And amidst this context, there are no new set of rules or regulations. So this means that the young entrepreneurs or developers in crypto in Korea, this means that there is room for you to design global standards and global ideas. So I hope that you would set out to capture those opportunities going forward.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's turn to Q&A. We have exactly 10 minutes left. Who wants to ask a question? Can't really see, but just raise your hand.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저 창원에서 NFT 게임 개발하고 있는
I
오렌지
develop
스텝의
NFT
김영이라고 합니다.
games in Changwon in Korea.
제가 이 산업을 들어오기 시작하면서
So after jumping into this industry, I have keep myself updated on. I never knew that I would have to keep an eye out for SEC, filings and their lawsuit cases. So I keep having that feeling that they are avoiding putting out a clear set of regulations. The SEC, it seems like they're avoiding this. So when do you think they would put out a clear set of regulations?
Howard, I think that's for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really important to ask that question with respect to NFTs as well, because the SEC has charged a bunch of NFT promoters alleging for the first time that those are securities as well. There's been an enormous amount of criticism of the SEC's failure to put out regulations, and some of that criticism is coming from inside the House. Commissioner Hester Peirce, who is sometimes referred to as the crypto mom, has criticized a lot of the SEC's enforcement actions, as has Commissioner Uyeda, because rather than issue a set of rules, the SEC has created a set of enforcement actions. So unfortunately, at least until early 2025, I don't think it's likely that the SEC is going to sit down and actually hammer out a regulatory framework for this.
Thank you. Anyone else? Other questions? Oh, yeah.
네, 미래비비 컴퍼니 대표
Yes,
김영민이라고
hello, I'm the
합니다.
CEO of MireBB. So I think we had a very constructive discussion on CBDC and Bitcoin. As far as I understand, China is at the lead in CBDC at the moment. They started very early, and in Korea, we worked on it until 2019, and then we put a stop to it. And then right now, I think we are currently putting the final touches on our own CBDC. So my question is, so when it comes to CBDC and Bitcoins and the future, I don't know, maybe dynamics going forward, how do you think this would play out in general? And So that's one question. And the second question is CBDC and the Bitcoins and stable coins, all of these things in connection to each other. Could you explain, the dynamics between CBDC and stable coins and, the other coins?
Sure. That's a great question. I'm glad somebody brought up CBDCs. I can quickly answer, and then if you guys have anything else to add. So CBDCs, yeah, as you mentioned, China definitely was, the leader in this area. I think it probably still is, although we've heard less about it recently. I think CBDCs face a similar problem to the one that I mentioned about cryptocurrency, at least on the retail side, is that a lot of people don't see why we need it. So, the issue is like, okay, we already have stable coins, we already have cryptocurrency, why do we even need a CBDC? I think that conversation is happening in a lot of countries. Furthermore, in the United States, for example, people are very interesting thing happening in the United States, which is that CBDCs have become a political issue, and they've even become a presidential campaign issue, because there's this kind of feeling in the United States, which is probably not, it's not based on anything specific, this idea that CBDCs are like this government surveillance tool. It's basically like the government will have this special money that they can use to know everything you buy, and they can stop you from buying things. There are actually quite a few Americans that believe this, and there's a handful of politicians that are kind of saying this, and they are actually talking about banning CBDCs in certain states because they see it as kind of like a tool of government oppression. So, there's a lot of kind of misunderstandings out there about what a US CBDC would look like. For your second question about how CBDCs and stablecoins and Bitcoin fit together, I mean, my personal view is that these are all completely different instruments. I mean, CBDCs and Bitcoin, for example, are completely opposite, right? The whole point of Bitcoin is that it's supposed to exist without any government. CBDCs are literally issued by a government. So you could make the argument that CBDCs are necessary for certain things, but I don't think it could ever replace Bitcoin. And stablecoins also, it's not as decentralized as Bitcoin necessarily, but they're not issued by a government. So I think they're three very separate things. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add. So
Emily,
yeah.
Let me add in one more thing.
Sure.
So can I speak in Korean to him?
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. 굉장히 좋은 질문 하시셨는데.
So thank you very much for that nice question, and I think Emily summed it up really well. So I just want to add one more point to what Emily said. So just like Emily really well put, retail CBDC isn't really necessary because our banking system is already very well constructed. So wholesale CBDC or WCBDC is kind of the talk of the town. So where can this have much impact? It would be in cross-border impact, where the government's involvement is small, and the BIS, the global body, is running a lot of projects regarding this. So in Switzerland, they have the project Zura, where they are, when it comes to commercial papers, they are issuing commercial papers on the blockchain as they do FX trading. So with the FX, they have this automated system where they convert FX into other products. They are currently going through the proof of concept stage right now. So that's why I'm saying tokenization of payments is so important. And what we need to think about at this very important point in time is when it comes to SDOs or security token offerings in Korea, people have a lot of questions about the eligibility of ledgers, why we cannot use public chains like Ethereum. But the problem lies in payments. So no country will be willing to put a payment system on a public chain. So in the United States, you can see a lot of issues surrounding securitization. So we see that's why they're using dual ledgers in a sort of mirroring structure. So when it comes to CBDC, WCBDC in particular, I believe it could have more use cases in cross-border payments. And then maybe domestically, it can have more presence.
Okay, I think we might have room for like one really fast question if anybody has. Anybody? It has to be really fast though. No. Okay. Really fast though.
really simple question.
Okay.
How would you define a security, and do you think ADA falls under that bracket?
All right, that's for you, Howard.
How would we define a security? Okay, I mean,
Just settle it right now.
look, technically a security under US law is something which involves a grant of money with an expectation of returns through the efforts of others. That's a really vague and broad definition, but essentially what is key is whether something is seen as an investment or a use. Right now, with respect to almost every token or coin that is transacted, there is tons of discourse saying, get this token because it will be worth more later. And so by using that language, rather than the language of use, but using the language of exchange, that almost necessarily predetermines a determination by the SEC and US regulatory authorities that the instrument at issue is in fact a security.
Did you want to answer the ADA question?
Oh, we're running out of time. Look at that. Oh no.
Clock ran out. Okay.
Huh.
Saved by the clock.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all so much. This panel went by really quickly, which is amazing for a long panel. So thank you. Really appreciate it.